Why, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to The Reader, where I read books for your enjoyment. We are reading Assassin's Creed The Secret Crusade at this moment, and I have some very good news, because I have a very first subscriber. Thank you very much to Rheumatic YT, which probably stands for YouTube, for subscribing to me. This really means a lot to me since I don't have any subscribers beside you, and I wasn't quite sure whether the world was waiting for someone like me, and apparently someone in the world is. So once again, thank you very, very much. Now let's get back to the book. Last time, Altair's father actually died because he had killed a general in Salah al-Din's camp, and he was therefore executed. This time we will continue with chapter 4 and 5. So once again, a big thank you to Rheumatic YouTube for subscribing to me, and I hope you will enjoy this video. Chapter 4, 20th of June 1257. This morning I awoke with Maffeo shaking my shoulder. Not especially gently, I should add. However, his insistence was prompted by an interest in my story. For that at least I should be grateful. So, he said. So what? If I sounded sleepy, well, that's because I was. So what happened to Ahmad? That I was to discover at a later date, brother. So tell me. As I pulled myself to a sitting position in my bed, I gave the matter some thought. I think it best that I tell you the stories just as they were told to me, I said at last. Altair, aging though he is quite the teller of tales. I believe I shall adhere to his narrative. And what I related to you yesterday formed the bulk of our very first meeting together, an episode that took place when he was just 11 years old. Traumatic for any child, reflected Maffeo. What of his mother? Died in childbirth. Altair, an orphan at 11? Indeed. What happened to him? Well, you know what happened. He sits up in his tower and... No, I mean, what happened to him next? That also will have to wait, brother. The next time I saw Altair, he had moved the focus of his narrative forward by 15 years, to a day that found him creeping through the dark, dripping catacombs beneath Jerusalem. The year was 1191, more than 3 years since Salah al-Din and his Saracens had captured Jerusalem. In response, the Christians had gnashed their teeth, stamped their feet, and taxed their people in order to fund the Third Crusade, and once more men in chainmail had marched upon the Holy Land and laid siege to its cities. England's King Richard, the one they called Lionheart, as cruel as it was courageous, had recently recaptured Acre, but his greatest desire was to retake Jerusalem, a holy site, and nowhere in Jerusalem was more sacred than the Temple Mount and the ruins of the Temple of Solomon, towards which Altair, Malik and Kadar crept. They moved fast but stealthily, clinging to the sides of the tunnels, their soft boots barely disturbing the sand. Altair went ahead, Malik and Kadar a few paces behind, all with senses tuned to their surroundings, their pulses quickening as they came closer to the mount. The catacombs were thousands of years old, and looked every day of it. Altair could see sand and dust trickling from unsteady wooden supports, while underfoot the ground was soft, the sand wet with the water that dripped steadily from overhead. Some kind of nearby watercourse. The air was thick with the smell of sulphur from the bitumen-soaked lanterns that lined the tunnel walls. Altair was the first to hear the priest. Of course he was. He was the leader, the master assassin. His skills were greater, his senses sharper. He stopped. He touched his ear, then held up his hand, and all three became still, like wraiths in the passage. When he glanced back, they were awaiting the next command. Kadar's eyes gleamed with anticipation, Malik's were watchful and flinty. All three held their breath. Around them the water dripped, and Altair listened intently to the priest's mumblings. The false Christian piety of a templar. Now Altair placed his hand behind his back and flicked his wrist to engage his blade, feeling the familiar pull on the ring mechanism he wore on his little finger. He kept his blade in good order so that the noise it made when it released was almost inaudible. He timed it to the water droplets just to be sure. Drip, drip, Snick. He brought his arms forward, and the blade at his left hand glittered in the flickering torchlight, thirsty for blood. Next, Altair flattened himself to the tunnel wall and moved forward stealthily, rounding a slight bend until he could see the priest kneeling in the tunnel. He wore the robes of a templar, which could only mean there were more ahead, probably within the ruins of the temple. In search of their treasure, no doubt. His heart quickened. It was just as he thought. That the city was under Salah al-Din's control wasn't going to stop the men of the Red Cross. They too had business at the mound. What business? Altair intended to find out, but first there was the priest to take care of. Crouched low, he moved behind the kneeling man who prayed on, unaware of death's proximity. Shifting his way to his front foot and bending at the knee slightly, Altair raised the blade, his hand bent back, ready to strike. "Wait!" hissed Malik from behind him. "There must be another way. This one need not die." Altair ignored him. In one fluid movement, he grasped the priest's shoulder with his right hand and with his left jammed the point of the blade into the back of his neck, slicing between the skull and the first vertebra on the backbone, severing his spine. The priest had no time to scream. Death was almost instantaneous. Almost. His body jerked and was tautened, but Altair held him firm, feeling his life ebb away as he held him with one finger on his carotid artery. Slowly, the body relaxed, and Altair allowed it to crumple silently to the ground where it lay, a spreading pool of blood blotted by the sand. It had been quick, soundless. But as Altair retracted the blade, he saw the way Malik looked at him and the accusation in his eyes. It was all that he could do to suppress a sneer at Malik's weakness. Malik's brother Qadar, on the other hand, was even now looking down at the priest's body with a mixture of wonderment and awe. "An excellent kill," he said breathlessly. "Fortune favors your blade." "Not fortune," boasted Altair. "Skill! Watch a while longer and you might learn something." As he said it, he watched Malik carefully, seeing the assassin's eyes flare angrily, jealous no doubt at the respect Qadar afforded Altair. Sure enough, Malik turned on his brother. "Indeed, he'll teach us how to disregard everything the master taught us." Altair sneered once more. "And how would you have done it?" "I would not have drawn attention to us. I would not have taken the life of an innocent." Altair sighed. "It matters not how we complete our task, only that it's done." "But that is not the way," started Malik. Altair fixed him with a stare. "My way is better." For a moment or so the two men glared at one another. Even in the dank, cold and dripping tunnel, Altair could see in Malik's eyes the insolence, the resentment. He would need to be careful of that, he knew. It seemed that young Malik was an enemy in waiting. But if he had designs on usurping Altair, Malik evidently decided that now was not the right moment to make his stand. "I will scout ahead," he said. "Try not to dishonor us further." Any punishment for that particular insubordination would have to wait, decided Altair, as Malik left, heading up the tunnel in the direction of the temple. Qadar watched him go, then turned to Altair. "What is our mission?" he asked. "My brother would say nothing to me, only that I should be honored to have been invited." Altair regarded the enthusiastic young pup. "The master believes the Templars have found something beneath the temple mounds." "Treasure?" gushed Qadar. "I do not know. All that matters is the master considered it important, else he would not have asked me to retrieve it." Qadar nodded, and at a wave of the hand from Altair, darted off to join his brother, leaving Altair alone in the tunnel. He looked down, pondering, at the body of the priest, a halo of blood on the sand around the head. Malik might have been right. There had been other ways of silencing the priest. He hadn't had to die. But Altair had killed him because he could. Because he was Altair Ibn La'Ahad, born of an assassin father, the most skilled in all those in the assassin order. A master assassin. He set off, coming to a series of pits, mist floating in their depths, and leaped easily to the first crossbeam, lightly landing and crouching cat-like, breathing steadily, enjoying his own power and athleticism. He jumped to the next and to the next, then came to where Malik and Qadar stood waiting for him. But rather than acknowledge them, he ran past, the sound of his feet like a whisper on the ground, barely disturbing the sand. Ahead of him was a tall ladder, and he took it at a run, scampering up quickly and quietly. only slowing when he reached the very top, where he stopped, listening and sniffing the air. Next, very slowly, he raised his head to see an elevated chamber, and there, as he had expected, stood a guard with his back to him, wearing the outfit of a templar. Padded gambeson jacket, leggings, chainmail, sword at his hip. Altair, silent and still, studied him for a moment, taking note of his posture, the dip in his shoulder. Good. He was tired and distracted. Silencing him would be easy. Slowly Altair pulled himself to the ground, where he crouched for a moment, steadying his breathing and watching the Templar carefully, before moving up behind him, straightening and raising his hands, his left a claw, his right ready to reach and silence the guard. Then he struck, snapping his wrist to engage the blade, which sprang forward in the same instant that he rammed it into the guard's spine, reaching with his right hand to smother the man's scream. For a moment they stood in a macabre embrace, Altair feeling the tickle of his victim's final muffled shout beneath his hand. Then the guard was crumpling, and Altair lowered him gently to the ground, stooping to brush his eyelids closed. He had been punished severely for his failure as a lookout, Altair thought grimly, as he straightened from the corpse and moved off, joining Malik and Kadar as they crept beneath the arch that had been so poorly guarded. Once through, they found themselves on an upper level of a vast chamber, and for a moment Altair stood taking it in, feeling slightly overawed. This was the ruin of the fabled Solomon's Temple, said to have been built in 960 BC by King Solomon. If Altair was correct, they stood now overlooking the temple's greater house, its holy place. Early writings spoke of the holy place as having its walls lined with cedar, carved cherubim, palm trees and open flowers embossed with gold. But the temple was now a shadow of its former self. Gone were the ornate wood, the cherubim and the gold finishing, to where Altair could only guess, though he had little doubt the Templars had had a hand in it. Yet even stripped of its gilding, it was still a place of reverence, and despite himself, Altair found himself filled with wonder to see it. Behind him, his two companions were even more awestruck. "There, that must be the Ark," said Malik, pointing across the chamber. "The Ark of the Covenant," gasped Kadar, seeing it too. Altair had recovered, and glanced over to see the two men standing like a pair of foolish merchants dazzled at the sight of shiny baubles. "Ark of the Covenant?" "Don't be silly," he chided. "There's no such thing, it's just a story." Looking over, though, he was less sure. Certainly the box had all the properties of the fabled Ark. It was just as the prophets had always described, plated entirely with gold, a golden cover adorned with cherubim, and rings for inserting the poles that would be used to carry it. And there was something about it, Altair realized. It had an aura. He tore his eyes away from it. More important matters needed his attention, namely the men who had just entered on the lower level, their boots crunching on what had once been fur-board flooring but was now bare stone. Templars, their leader already barking orders. "I want it through the gate before sunrise," he told them, referring no doubt to the Ark. "The sooner we possess it, the sooner we can turn our attention to those jackals at Masyaf." He spoke with a French accent, and as he came into the light, they saw his distinctive cape, that of the Templar Grand Master. "Robert de Sable," said Altair. "His life is mine." Malik rounded on him angrily. "No! We were asked to retrieve the treasure and deal with Robert only if necessary." Altair, tired of Malik's constant defiance, turned on him. "He stands between us and it," he hissed angrily. "I'd say it's necessary." "Discretion, Altair," urged Malik. "You mean cowardice. That man is our greatest enemy, and here we have a chance to be rid of him." Still Malik argued. "You have already broken 2 tenets of our creed. Now you would break the 3rd. Do not compromise the Brotherhood." Finally Altair snapped. "I am your superior, in both title and ability. You should know better than to question me." And with that he turned, climbing quickly down the first ladder to a lower balcony, then to the floor where he strode confidently towards the group of knights. They saw him coming and turned to face him, their hands on the hilts of their swords, their jaws set. Altair knew that they would be watching him, watching the assassin as he glided across the floor towards them, his face hidden by his cowl, his robes and red sash flowing about him, the sword at his hip and the hilts of his short sword showing over his right shoulder. He knew the fear they would be feeling. and he in turn watched them, mentally assessing each man. Which of them was a right-handed swordsman, which fought with his left? Who was built for speed and who would be strongest, paying particular attention to their leader? Robert de Sable was the largest of them, the most powerful. His head was shaved, and etched into his face were years of experience, every one of which had contributed to his legend, that of a knight as famed for his skill with the sword as he was for his cruelty and ruthlessness. And this Altair knew above all, that of the men present, he was by far the most dangerous. He had to be neutralized first. He heard Malik and Kadar drop from the ladders and glanced behind to see them following his lead. Kadar swallowing, nervous, Malik's eyes flashing his disapproval. The Templars tensed further at the sight of two more assassins, the numbers more even now. 4 of them surrounded de Sable, each man alert, the air thick with fear and suspense. "Hold, Templars!" called Altair, when he was close enough to the 5 knights. He addressed de Sable, who stood with a thin smile upon his lips, his hands hanging at his sides. Not like his companions, ready for combat, but relaxed, as though the presence of these 3 assassins was of little significance to him. Altair would make him pay for his arrogance. "You are not the only ones with business here," he added. The 2 men weighed each other up. Altair moved his right hand as though ready to grasp the hilt of the sword at his belt, wanting to keep de Sable's attention there, when in fact death would snick smoothly from the left. Yes, he decided, feint with the right, strike with the left, dispatch Robert de Sable with the blade, and his men would flee, leaving the assassins to retrieve the treasure. All would talk of Altair's great victory over the Templar Grand Master. Malik, that coward, would be silenced, his brother wonder-struck afresh, and on the return to Masyaf the members of the order would venerate Altair. Al-Mualim would honor him personally, and Altair's path to the position of master would be assured. Altair looked into the eyes of his opponent. Imperceptibly, he flexed his left hand, testing the tension of the blade mechanism. He was ready. "And what is it you want?" asked de Sable, with that same unconcerned smile. "Blood," said Altair simply, and struck. With inhuman speed he leapt at de Sable, flicking the blade at the same moment, feinting with his right hand and striking as fast and deadly as a cobra with his left. But the Templar Grand Master was quicker and more cunning than he had anticipated. He caught the assassin mid-attack, seemingly with ease, so that Altair was stopped in his tracks, unable to move and suddenly horrifyingly helpless. And in that moment Altair realized he had made a grave mistake, a fatal mistake. In that moment he knew it was not de Sable who was arrogant, it was himself. All of a sudden he no longer felt like Altair the master assassin. He felt like a weak and feeble child, worse, a bragging child. He struggled and found he could barely move, de Sable holding him easily. He felt a sharp stab of shame, thinking of Malik and Kadar, seeing him brought low, de Sable's hand squeezing his throat, and he found himself gasping for breath as the Templar pushed his face towards him. A vein in his forehead throbbed. "You know not the things in which you meddle, assassin. I spare you only that you may return to your master and deliver a message. The Holy Hand is lost to him and his. He should flee now, while he has the chance. Stay, and all of you will die." Altair choked and spluttered, the edge of his vision beginning to fade, fighting unconsciousness as de Sable twisted him, and easily as though handling a newborn, and tossed him towards the back wall of the chamber. Altair crashed through the ancient stone and into the vestibule on the other side, where he lay stunned for a moment, hearing beams fall and the huge pillars of the chamber crash in. He looked up and saw that his entrance to the temple was blocked. From the other side he heard shouts, de Sable crying, "Men to arms! Kill the assassins!" He scrambled to his feet and dashed to the rubble, trying to find a way through. With shame and helplessness burning him, he heard the cries of Malik and Kadar, their screams as they died, and finally, his head low, he turned and began to make his way out of the temple for the journey to Masyaf, there to bring the master the news that he had failed, that he, the great Altair, had brought dishonor upon himself and upon the order. When he finally emerged from the bowels of the Temple Mount, it was into bright sunshine and a Jerusalem that teemed with life. Altair had never felt so alone. Chapter 5. Altair arrived at Masyaf after an exhausting 5-day ride, during which he had had more than enough time to reflect upon his failure. And thus it was with the heaviest of hearts that he arrived at the gates, was allowed in by the guards, and made his way to the stables. Dismounting and feeling his knotted muscles relax at last, he handed his horse to the stable boy, then stopped by the well to take some water, sipping it at first, then gulping it, and last splashing it over himself, gratefully rubbing the dirt from his face. He still felt the grime of the journey upon his body though. His robes hung heavy and filthy, and he looked forward to washing in the shimmering waters of Masyaf, hidden away in an alcove of a cliff face. All he craved now was solitude. As he made his way through the outskirts of the village, his gaze was drawn upwards, past the stable huts and bustling markets to the winding paths that led to the ramparts of the assassin's fortress. Here was where the order trained and lived under the command of Al-Mualim, whose quarters stood in the centre of the citadel's Byzantine towers. He was often to be seen staring from the window of his tower, lost in thought, and Altair pictured him there now, gazing down upon the village. The same village that bustled with life, bright with sunshine and loud with business, to which 10 days ago Altair, leaving for Jerusalem with Malik and Qadar, had planned to return as a triumphant hero. Never, not in his darkest imaginings, had he foreseen failure. And yet, an assassin hailed him as he made his way across the sun-dappled marketplace, and he pulled himself together, pushing back his shoulders and holding up his head, trying to summon from within the great assassin who had left Masyaf rather than the empty-handed fool who had returned. It was Rauf, and Altair's heart sank further, if that were possible, which he sincerely doubted. Of all the people to greet him on his return, it would have to be Rauf, who worshipped Altair like a god. It looked as though the younger man had been waiting for him, whiling away the time by a walled fountain. Indeed, he bounded up now, with wide and eager eyes, oblivious to the nimbus of failure that Altair felt around himself. "Altair, you've returned!" He was beaming, as pleased as a puppy to see him. Altair nodded slowly. He watched behind Rauf as an elderly merchant refreshed himself at the fountainhead, then greeted the younger woman who arrived carrying a vase decorated with gazelles. She placed it on the low wall surrounding the water hole, and they began to talk. The woman excited, gesticulating. Altair envied them. He envied them both. "It is good to see you are unharmed," continued Rauf. "I trust your mission was a success?" Altair ignored the question, still watching those at the fountain. He was finding it difficult to meet Rauf's eye. "Is the master in his tower?" he asked at last, tearing his gaze away. "Yes, yes." Rauf was squinting, as though to divine somehow what was wrong with him. "Buried in his books, as always. No doubt he expects you." "My thanks, brother." And with that, he left Rauf and the chattering village folk at the fountainhead and began to make his way past the covered stalls and hay carts and benches, over the paving until the dry and dusty ground sloped sharply upwards, the parched grass brittle in the sunshine, all paths leading to the castle. Never had he felt so much in its shadow, and he found himself clenching his fists as he crossed the plateau and was greeted by the guards at fortress approach, their hands on the hilts of their swords, their eyes watchful. Now he reached the grand archway that led to the barbican, and once more his heart sank as he saw a figure he recognized within. Abbas. Abbas stood beneath a torch that chased away what little dark there was within the arch. He was leaning against a rough dark stone, bare-handed, his arms folded and his sword at his hip. Altair stopped, and for a moment or so the two men regarded each other as Villagem moved around them, oblivious of the old enmity blooming afresh between the two assassins. Once they had called each other brother, but that time was long past. Abbas smiled slowly, mockingly. "Ah, he returns at last." He looked pointedly over Altair's shoulder. "Where are the others? Did you ride ahead, hoping to be the first one back? I know you are loath to share the glory." Altair did not answer. "Silence is just another form of assent," added Abbas, still trying to goad him, and doing it with all the cunning of an adolescent. "Have you nothing better to do?" sighed Altair. "I bring word from the master." "He waits for you in the library," said Abbas. He ushered Altair past. "Best hurry. No doubt you're eager to put your tongue to his boot." "Another word," retorted Altair, and I'll put my blade to your throat. Abbas replied, "There will be plenty of time for that later, brother." Altair shouldered past him and continued to the courtyard and training square, and then to the doorway to Al-Mualim's tower. Guardsmen bowed their head to him, affording him the respect a master assassin rightfully commanded, and he acknowledged them, knowing that soon, as long as it took word to spread, their respect would be a memory. But first he had to deliver the terrible news to Al-Mualim, and he made his way up the steps of the tower towards the master's chamber. Here the room was warm, the air heavy with its customary sweet scent. Dust danced in the shafts of light from the great window at the far end, where the master stood, his hands clasped behind his back. His master, his mentor, a man he venerated above all others, the man he'd failed. In a corner, the master's carrier pigeons cooed quietly in their cage, and around him were his books and manuscripts, thousands of years of assassin literature and learning, either on shelves or stacked in tottering, dusty piles. His sumptuous robes flowed around him, his long hair lay over his shoulders, and he was, as usual, contemplative. "Master," said Altair, breaking the thick silence. He lowered his head. Wordless, Al-Mualim turned and moved towards his desk. Scrolls littered the floor beneath it. He regarded Altair with one sharp, flinty eye. His mouth, hidden within his grey-white beard, betrayed no emotion until at last he spoke, beckoning to his pupil. "Come forward. Tell me of your mission. I trust you have recovered the Templar treasure?" Altair felt a trickle of perspiration make its way from his forehead and down his face. "There was some trouble, master. Robert de Sable was not alone." Al-Mualim waved away the notion. "When does our work ever go as expected? It's our ability to adapt that makes us who we are." This time it was not enough. Al-Mualim took a moment to absorb Altair's words. He moved from behind his desk, and when he next spoke, his voice was sharp. "What do you mean?" Altair found himself having to force out the words. "I have failed you. The treasure? Lost to us." The atmosphere in his rooms changed. It seemed to tense and crackle as though brittle, and there was a pause before Al-Mualim spoke again. "And Robert?" "Escaped." The word fell like a stone in darkening space. Now Al-Mualim came closer to Altair. His one eye was bright with anger, his voice barely restrained, his fury filling the room. "I send you, my best man, to complete a mission more important than any that has come before, and you return to me with nothing but apologies and excuses?" I did. "Do not speak!" His voice was a whip crack. "Not another word! This is not what I expected. We'll need to mount another force, so I swear to you I'll find him. I'll go and—" began Altair, who was already desperate to meet the Sable again. This time the outcome would be different. Now Al-Mualim was looking about himself, as though only just recalling that, when Altair had left Masyaf, he had done so with two companions. "Where are Malik and Kadar?" he demanded. A second bead of sweat made its way down Altair's temple as he replied, "Dead." "No!" came a voice from behind them. "Not dead!" Al-Mualim and Altair turned to see a ghost. And there we are. Those were chapters 4 and 5 of Assassin's Creed The Secret Crusade. I hope you truly enjoyed them. Obviously, if you did like it, please leave a like. You can always subscribe if you feel like it as well. If you have any books you would like me to read, you can let me know in a comment. And once again, thank you to my first ever subscriber. I hope you will hear from me later. Goodbye.